Okay, King Lear. So I think of Hamlet as being Shakespeare's most intellectual tragedy and Macbeth as his most terrifying. It's like watching a horror movie. And Othello is his most disturbing and unsettling. But King Lear, I think, has the distinction of being his most emotionally depleting tragedy. The physical torment, the sobbing, the heaving, the bellowing, the mad raving, it's relentless to the very end. It must have been physically exhausting for the actors to perform. The photograph that you see here, obviously King Lear, played by the great Shakespearean actor Robert Mantell. He was the great uncle of the late Angela Lansbury, star of the popular TV mystery series Murder She Wrote, which I loved as a kid. But Mantell considered his role as Lear his finest achievement as an actor, and we see him here as he appears in Act 4 when he is cited by his daughter Cordelia, as she says, "He was met even now as mad as the vexed sea, singing aloud, crowned with rank fumitory and furrow weeds, with burdocks, hemlock, nettles, cuckoo flowers, darnel, and all the idle weeds that grow in our sustaining corn." Unlike other plays of this period in Shakespeare's career, Measure for Measure and Hamlet especially, much of King Lear requires us to imagine scenes taking place in the open air, outdoors, on the desolate, storm-swept heath and cliff tops overlooking a raging sea. Whereas in Hamlet, Othello, and Macbeth, much of the drama unfolds on castle ramparts and in chambered spaces. The characters of Lear move through a fierce elemental world. Natural forces operate on them relentlessly. Storms, wind, cold, stinging insects. One of the core themes of the play is the fraught boundary between nature and civilization. It asks, are the evils that men do a violation of natural law and order, or are they rather consistent with the generative and destructive rhythms of the universe, procreation and predation, community and competition, fecundity and decay? Is the social order the hierarchy that places a king over his subjects, that prioritizes eldest sons over younger, male children over female, husbands over wives? Is that hierarchy an aspect of some larger universal order and infallible product of providential design? Or is it an arbitrary social construct dependent on institutional authority that is intractably flawed, corruptible, and that brings out the worst in human beings? What is natural in the relationship between fathers and their children? What natural or unnatural causes result in the breakdown of these relationships? While our lives are much different than the Renaissance world Shakespeare anachronistically transposes onto Iron Age Britain, we ask similar questions today. Grappling as we grapple with the issues of our own time. Boy, that was a really long preamble, wasn't it? So here's the title page to the first quarto of King Lear. So Shakespeare probably wrote King Lear around 1604, 1605. Like several of his other tragedies, there are two distinct versions of the play. There's the quarto you see here, published by Nathaniel Butter in 1608. The printer was Nicholas Oakes. This is one of Oakes's first, I believe this is one of his first plays that he printed. He would later print the Othello quarto as well in 1622. And it's a notoriously flawed quarto. A lot of the verse is rendered in prose, and I'm not going to get into that here. But this is the important first quarto, and then the other version is the 1623 folio. As is the case with both Hamlet and Othello, there are substantive differences between the two versions. The quarto text contains roughly 300 lines, including all of Act 4, Scene 3, and are not included in the folio, while the folio has about 100 lines absent from the quarto. Most scholars believe that the shorter folio text was probably based on a prompt book, that is, a version that was edited and prepared for performance, whereas the quarto probably derived from Shakespeare's foul papers. Most modern editions, including the Norton Shakespeare, value both texts and conflate the two versions. And we are, in this presentation, I will be citing from the Norton's conflated Shakespeare text. The Norton renders the quarto variants, the significant ones anyway, in italic font. Shakespeare was not the first playwright to dramatize the story of King Lear. An anonymously written version was staged sometime in the late 1580s. Shakespeare may have acted in it, and possibly revived around 1605 when it was finally published in a quarto format, which you see now on the left. Whatever the case, Shakespeare was motivated or encouraged to take up the subject for The King's Men. Clearly, the earlier quarto title, The Chronicle History of King Lear and His Three Daughters, was the source for the title printed by Oakes. But certain obvious steps were taken to distinguish Shakespeare's version from its rival and enhance its market appeal. Perhaps the most obvious one is the placement of Shakespeare's name. This is very unusual. Master William Shakespeare at the very top of the title page. But there's also the attention given to the character of Edgar. The whole Edgar Edmund secondary plot is absent from the earlier version, and then the emphasis on royal patronage, as it was played before the King's Majesty at Whitehall upon St. Stephen's Night and Christmas holidays by His Majesty's servants, playing usually at the Globe on the Bankside. So just to show you a couple of significant examples of variation between the quarto text and the folio. On the left, we have the beginning, a passage from close to the beginning of the opening scene of Act 3. This would be lines 8 through 23 of the Norton's conflated text. And the difference here, this is Kent talking with a gentleman about unrest in the country, and he attributes it to an imminent French invasion. On the right is the folio text, which focuses more on a civil war brewing between Albany and Cornwall, the two dukes who are Lear's sons-in-law. So here on the left we see, but true it is, from France there comes a power into this scattered kingdom, who already wise in our negligence have secret feet in some of our best ports and are at point to show their open banner. Well, that is eliminated from the folio text and replaced with a substantial elaboration on the theme of civil war and the differences between the Dukes of Albany and Cornwall. Another scene. This is later in Act 3. This is scene 7. This is the conclusion of the horrible scene of Gloucester's enucleation when he has his eyes ripped out of his head. At the end of that scene in the quarto, there's a discussion between a couple of servants. They comment on what they've just witnessed. They judge. They judge Cornwall and Regan, his wife, and the first servant says, "I'll never care what wickedness I do if this man come to good." And the second servant is talking about Regan. He says, if she live long and in the end meet the old course of death, women will all turn monsters. And then the second servant at the very end says, go thou, I'll fetch some flax and whites of eggs to apply to his bleeding face, that is to Gloucester's bleeding face. Now heaven help him. So this is a scene of kind of moral indignation, but also an expression of or demonstration of sympathy and compassion for somebody who's been horribly treated. And in the folio, that's all removed. It just ends with Cornwall saying, I've received a hurt. Regan, I bleed at pace. Untimely comes this hurt. Give me your arm. And then they all exit the stage. And that's the end of the scene. And that exchange between the servants is removed completely, which is interesting. It's interesting that it was cut from the folio. You'll also notice that in the folio, there are act and scene divisions, and there are no act or scene divisions in the 1608 quarto text. So chronologically, King Lear is the third of Shakespeare's great tragedies, that is his mature tragedies. It's preceded by Hamlet and Othello, and would be followed by Macbeth in 1606. Although written very close together, these plays are thematically quite different. Hamlet is a revenge tragedy that brings down an entire royal house. Othello is a domestic tragedy in which jealousy turns the hero's marriage bed into a scene of carnage. Macbeth is a tragedy of murderous ambition that leads to civil war. But Lear gives us something entirely unique, a family tragedy. It raises different questions than its cousins about parental authority, filial duty, and the generational transfer of power and estates. At the same time, Lear's the first in a series of late plays taking their subject matter from ancient, and that is pre-Norman conquest British history. Macbeth is set in 11th century Scotland. Cymbeline, which is completed later around 1610, is set in the 1st century prior to the Roman conquest of Britain. But the historical source for Lear dates even farther back to the 8th century BCE. As he did with other history plays, Shakespeare relied on Raphael Holinshed's Chronicles of England, Scotland, and Ireland, the second edition of 1587. But he also would have been familiar, obviously, with the earlier play, The Chronicle History of King Lear and His Three Daughters. And again, he may even have performed in it in the early 1590s. Despite the historical subject matter, and despite the play being labeled a history on the title page of the 1608 quarto, Lear would be retitled a tragedy. His daughters would be removed from the title, and it would be indexed as a tragedy along with Macbeth and Cymbeline in the 1623 folio. I'll take a look at some of the characters here, the major ones. Obviously, King Lear and his three daughters. Lear has a close resemblance to Shakespeare's other tyrannical father figures, Aegeus, Midsummer Night's Dream, Brabantio from Othello, Duke Frederick, As You Like It. And what's noteworthy is that in all these plays, there's no alternate authority or moderating influence of a mother figure. Considered from a practical standpoint, there had to be fewer female roles due to the prohibition against female actors, and the company's attendant reliance on relatively inexperienced adolescent boys to play female parts. And Hamlet discusses this with the players who perform at Elsinore. Introducing a mother into King Lear would have increased the number of major female parts to 4. But the absence of mother figures, of course, reflects the attitudes and priorities of the broader patriarchal culture of the time that deprived women, especially married women, of autonomy and authority. And one wonders if Shakespeare didn't leave mothers out of these plays for no other reason that he didn't think they would contribute much to the drama created by his independent and defiant daughters. One noteworthy exception to this that comes to mind for me is Lady Capulet in Romeo and Juliet, and she pretty much reinforces her husband's authority in the play. Lear has three daughters, Goneril, Regan, and Cordelia. Cordelia is the youngest of the three and the acknowledged favorite of the king. That's a sentiment that doesn't last long in the course of the play. And Goneril and Regan are already married. In fact, Goneril is married to the Duke of Albany, who becomes a figure of moral authority in the play. He's the only member of Lear's extended family who survives in the end. All of his daughters and his other son-in-law, Cornwall, they all die. And Goneril betrays the Duke of Albany. We'll talk more about that later in scene analysis. And the Duke of Cornwall is Regan's husband. And then we have some peripheral figures. The Earl of Kent. This is he's Lear's senior advisor. He's banished from court right in the beginning, the very first scene of the play. He's banished from court, sentenced to death, in fact, if he's caught. Yet he remains steadfastly devoted to the king throughout the play, disguising himself as a courtier named Caius. And he sticks with the king even after the king is basically homeless. He stays with him through all of that. And then we have this group, the Earl of Gloucester group. We're actually introduced to this family, or at least two members of this family, before Lear and his daughters come on stage. This is the story of Gloucester and his sons is probably the most carefully interwoven, tightly constructed secondary plot in all of Shakespeare. The story of another father, Gloucester, who also spurns the very child who loves him, this time a son, not a daughter, his son Edgar. And at the same time, he embraces the one who seeks his destruction. That's Edmund, the illegitimate bastard, similar to the bastard John in Much Ado About Nothing. These two brothers, Edgar and Edmund, will eventually clash during the play's climactic scenes. Until then, Edgar lives in hiding because he also has been sentenced to death, roaming the heath, disguised as the possessed madman, Poor Tom, or Tom of Bedlam. And his metamorphosis in Act 5 into this physically powerful, eloquently spoken, fully armored knight is quite remarkable, very impressive in performance. And there's also a fool character, and the fool is interesting, and just in the interest of time, I'm not going to be able to say enough about this character. But he accompanies Lear and then abruptly disappears about midway through the play, but has some memorable lines. So, as I sometimes do, I give you a picture from the famous Boydell Shakespeare series. This one's by Henry Fuseli, who had more paintings in that series than any other artist. And as you can see, his penchant for these titanic Michelangesque figures. Look at Lear's legs, for example, just so muscular and powerful looking. I think this scene's a little easier to identify than some of the others that I've shown in previous videos, but you can pause here, take a moment, see if you can figure out what it is, and more importantly, try to figure out all the characters, because many of the characters I just talked about are present in this image. So we've got King Lear, of course, that's pretty obvious. with the pointing finger of Michelangelo's God. There's Kent, his advisor, trying to restrain him. And Goneril. I say this is Goneril. I'm not quite sure, but Goneril is looking across the scene to the Edmund figure across the way there, who's gripping the hilt of his sword and looking at her. So I figured that's got to be Goneril. And there's her sister Regan and their husbands, Duke of Albany, and back there in the shadow, the Duke of Cornwall. And then Cordelia, of course, over on this side, the left side. And the Duke of Burgundy's got the fleur-de-lis clasp there on his tunic. And then the King of France, who has agreed to marry her and escorts her out of the scene. And then we have the secondary figures, the Earl of Gloucester back here, and I'm guessing that's Edgar. Just guessing there. I'm not quite sure, but I'm pretty sure that this would be Edmund. He looks a little malevolent, especially the way he's gripping his sword. The scene, of course, is Act 1, Scene 1, and I chose lines 179 to 193. There are a few other details that stand out here from that scene. Down at the bottom, underneath Lear's foot, is the map of the kingdom, which is divided into three pieces of territory to be distributed amongst the daughters. And then in the back is the crown that he talks about, line 136. So we'll do a synopsis now of the play, the act-by-act synopsis. There are, of course, the play's been divided into 5 acts. In 1608, in the quarto, it's not divided into acts or scenes. Not until the folio do we get these divisions. Large number of scenes. So Act 1 has 5 scenes. The Earl of Gloucester introduces his illegitimate son, Edmund, to the Earl of Kent. Kent is the king's senior advisor. Their conversation is interrupted by the entrance of Lear and his 3 daughters, who meet to settle the terms of Lear's retirement and divvy the kingdom between his daughters' husbands, the Dukes of Albany and Cornwall. His youngest daughter, Cordelia's portion, because she's unmarried, will be included in her dowry when she weds either the Duke of Burgundy or the King of France. The Duke of Burgundy is going to back out of this after what's about to happen. To finalize his decision, Lear compels his daughters to compete against each other in a verbal contest to prove who loves him most. We'll talk about that when we get into analysis of the scene later in the video. Cordelia refuses to participate, infuriating Lear, who rebukes and disinherits her. Kent urges the king to relent and is banished from court. Shocked by all this, shocked by Lear's temper and his treatment of Cordelia, the King of France agrees to marry her without a dowry. Goneril and Regan quietly remark on their father's rash, erratic behavior and anticipate trouble dealing with his irascibility and infirmity as he gets older. Meanwhile, frustrated by the laws of primogeniture, the bastard Edmund forges a letter in his elder brother Edgar's hand, the contents of which call his loyalty to his father into question. After Edmund turns over this letter, Gloucester directs him to investigate further, which of course Edmund is happy to do. When Edgar arrives on stage, Edmund informs him of their father's suspicion, but not his role in stoking those suspicions, and advises him to lie low until the matter is resolved. Later, at the Duke of Albany's castle, Goneril is irritated with her father's entitled behavior and abuse of his servants. At least that's the accusation that she makes. and she instructs her steward, Oswald, to ignore Lear and his men, expecting that they will get bored or decide to try the hospitality of Regan and her husband Cornwall instead. In defiance of Lear's order, Kent returns, disguised as Caius now, and ingratiates himself with the king, and he will remain that way for the rest of the play. Lear confronts Goneril over her changed attitude, and she protests the obnoxious behavior of his men and requests that he reduce the size of his retinue. Lear angrily rejects the proposal and decides to leave and stay with Goneril's sister, Regan. The fool warns him not to expect better treatment there. And in fact, he's correct. Act 2 is 4 scenes, so accelerating his plan to eliminate Edgar, Edmund accuses him of plotting to take their father's life. After receiving Goneril's account of Lear's peremptory behavior, the Duke of Cornwall and Regan leave their castle, I think to get away from him, to stay with Gloucester. And when they arrive there, Cornwall hears Edmund's testimony and agrees to have Edgar arrested and put to death. And we really begin to see at this point how the two plots of the play, the Lear plot and the Gloucester plot, become very tightly interwound. The Earl of Kent, meanwhile, gets into a heated dispute with Goneril's steward Oswald, who had earlier interfered with his attempt to deliver Lear's letters to Regan. Outraged at Kent's demeanor, Cornwall puts him in the stocks. And when no one is around, Kent discloses that he's been corresponding with Cordelia in France and is hopeful she will return to Britain and restore order. Now a wanted man, Edgar evades capture by wandering the desolate countryside disguised as Poor Tom, or Tom of Bedlam. Lear is outraged when he arrives at Gloucester's castle and discovers Kent in the stocks. And remember, he doesn't recognize Kent. He thinks Kent is Caius. He informs Regan of her sister's insolence, hoping to win her favor, but instead she recommends that he apologize and return to Albany's castle with a reduced number of men. When she refuses his attempt to stay with her instead, he curses both daughters and laments having no recourse to punish their impudence because he's given up that authority. And as they argue, a violent storm erupts and Lear is cast out into the elements and left to fend for himself. So Act 3 is next. I have a painting here. This is Benjamin West's painting of this scene. It's from the 1780s. This painting is in the same heroic idiom of Fuseli's paintings. They were contemporaries, actually. And we see King Lear there gesturing at the storm. We see Tom of Bedlam there in the bottom right. The Fool, Gloucester, everyone's there. So heartened by Cordelia, the King of France has quietly positioned his forces to invade Britain and restore her father to the throne. It's very much in the background at this point, but it gradually moves to the foreground. While searching for Lear, Kent encounters a man who saw him wandering across the heath in the storm. Kent requests that this man report Lear's condition to Cordelia, who is encamped with the French at Dover. Later, Kent finds Lear and leads him through the wind and rain to a crude peasant shelter, which we just saw in Benjamin West's painting. Elsewhere, in defiance of Cornwall's orders, Gloucester decides to assist Lear. With his brother Edgar pretty much already out of the way, sentenced to death, Edmund sees an opportunity to seize the earldom from his father by betraying him to Cornwall, which he does. Back at the hovel, Kent, Lear, and Lear's fool find that it is already occupied by Edgar, who's still disguised as Poor Tom at this point, raving about demons persecuting him for past sins. Gloucester eventually finds them in the hovel and insists they all return with him to the castle, where Edmund has already informed against him, although he doesn't know this yet, and turned over a letter implicating him as a French spy. Cornwall orders his arrest and rewards Edmund with his father's former title. Edmund is now the Earl of Gloucester. Meanwhile, an increasingly deranged Lear performs a mock trial of his daughters. He's about to lie down and get some desperately needed rest when Gloucester informs them it is no longer safe to stay there and formulates a plan to reunite Lear with Cordelia in Dover. Forewarned of the imminent French invasion, Cornwall dispatches Goneril and Edmund to notify Albany to prepare his forces. Now they have sort of a mutual cause to cooperate. In the meantime, Gloucester is apprehended, restrained in a chair, and interrogated, and Cornwall gouges out his eyeballs, and we'll take a look at that later. Appalled by this extreme display of cruelty, his servants, Cornwall's servants, protest, and one of them confronts Cornwall, and during the ensuing fight inflicts a mortal wound before he is himself slain by Regan. So now completely blind and turned out of his own house, Gloucester decides to make his way to Dover as well. Act 4 also has 7 scenes. This is also a Benjamin West painting. A little later, 1790s, early 1790s, shows Cordelia there and her father looking quite deranged, awakening from sleep. Doesn't really know where he is or why. Thinks he's dead at first. So on the heath, Gloucester is reunited with Edgar, who carries on his disguise as the bedeviled poor Tom. Edgar agrees to guide his father to the cliffs of Dover, and that's where Gloucester is determined to kill himself. At Albany's castle, Goneril and Edmund receive word from Oswald that the Duke, that is the Duke of Albany, is disgusted by his wife's treatment of Lear. After decrying her husband, Goneril reveals her desire for Edmund and sends him back to assist Cornwall in preparation for battle against the French. She stays behind to command Albany's men. After a fierce exchange with her husband, news comes that Cornwall has succumbed to his injury. He was attacked by his servant after gouging out Gloucester's eyes, and he dies. Albany finds it morally just that this happened. Goneril finds it politically convenient, but also worries now that her widowed sister Regan will move on Edmund. So there's this jealousy between the two sisters over Edmund. Meanwhile, Kent makes it to Dover, but learns that troubles back in France have paused the French offensive. That's going to make them weak when Edmund and Albany lead the British forces to oppose them. Lear is with Kent when he arrives, but is too ashamed and guilt-ridden to face his estranged daughter. Distraught by Kent's letters apprising her of her father's wretched condition, Cordelia forms a search party. Back at Gloucester's castle, Regan grows jealous when Oswald arrives with a letter from Goneril addressed to Edmund, who's already left to hunt down his father, whose pitiful condition is undermining their hold on power. They got to get rid of these people. They're too sympathetic. Accompanied by Edgar, Gloucester arrives at Dover, where he intends to throw himself from the cliff tops. Edgar tricks him into believing that he has jumped, but was saved by a divine miracle. At this point, Lear staggers in, raving against women, hypocrisy, and injustice. One of Cordelia's men recognizes him and takes him into custody. Then Oswald arrives. Oswald comes in next, searching for Edmund. He's got the letters from Goneril to deliver, but he recognizes Gloucester, and he remembers that Goneril wants Gloucester killed, so he attempts to kill Gloucester, but is slain by Edgar, who afterwards reads Goneril's letter to Edmund and discovers the truth of his brother's treachery, which includes now a plot to murder Albany. Later, at the French camp, Lear awakens in a state of extreme anguish and is reunited with Cordelia. Meanwhile, Edmund's army prepares to battle against the French. And Act 5 is 3 scenes. This is James Barrie's portrayal of, obviously, King Lear, grieving over Cordelia's corpse. We got Goneril and Regan stretched out on the ground below them. That's Edgar there in the suit of armor. I like in the background, there's that hinge. This sort of sets this play in the British Iron Age, sort of going way back in ancient British history when this play was set. Nice touch, nice detail. So at the British camp, Regan questions Edmund regarding his relationship with her sister. She's feeling very jealous, but they're interrupted by the arrival of Albany and Goneril too. And Edmund forms a fragile alliance with Albany to oppose the French. Edgar, still in his peasant disguise at this point, enters and slips Albany Goneril's letter to Edmund. So basically, this reveals that Goneril is encouraging Edmund to murder Albany and just sort of use the war as a cover for that injury. Before Albany can read it, however, Edmund announces the commencement of battle. The French are defeated and Lear and Cordelia captured. Realizing the danger to Gloucester at this point, if he's discovered, Edgar takes him into hiding. Edmund orders Cordelia to be hanged and make it appear a suicide. As they discuss Lear's fate, Regan proposes to marry Edmund, unaware that she has already been poisoned by her jealous rival Goneril. Now informed of Goneril's betrayal and her foiled plot to have him murdered, Albany arrests Edmund and charges him with treason. Following chivalric custom, Albany proposes a trial by combat and calls for witnesses to Edmund's crimes to present themselves. Edgar, at this point, hearing this call, decides the time has come to reveal himself to his father, but unable to bear the guilt of his past mistakes, Gloucester dies. Afterward, Edgar armors himself and defeats Edmund in combat. Presented with the evidence of her complicity in Edmund's treason, Goneril stabs herself to death. To redeem himself, Edmund attempts to rescind his order to kill Cordelia, but it is too late. Lear enters, carrying her lifeless body. Kent reveals himself to Lear, who at this point is mad with despair. Edmund succumbs to his injuries, and convinced that Cordelia has revived, Lear also dies. Albany then appoints Edgar and Kent co-rulers of Britain. Kent declines, believing he will shortly follow Lear to the grave, which just leaves Edgar, who says the time is not yet proper for anything but communal grief. And that is how the play ends. All right then, so we'll take a look at some scenes, starting with the important early scenes that lay out the circumstances that will drive the action for the rest of the play. Act 1, Scene 1, lines 35 to 185. This is Lear splitting up the kingdom between his daughters, their husbands, and which leads to his rebuke of Cordelia and the banishment of his top advisor Kent. So he's at this point, Lear is some 80 years old. He reveals this later in the play, and has decided to retire. He says to shake all cares and business from our age, conferring them on younger strengths, while we, unburdened, crawl toward death. That term in the last line I quoted there, unburdened, that's an important one. It implies a distinction that he's making between his public role, the duties, the obligations of a king, which he happily resigns, and the title to which he attaches his identity and self-worth, and he's not willing to let that go. So this decision raises one of the core problems of the play. Does the title of king inhere in the person or the role? He transfers what he calls rule, interest of territory, and cares of state to his sons-in-law, Cornwall and Albany, yet he wishes to retain the name and all the addition to a king, which is symbolized by the 100 knights that he keeps as his retinue when he goes to visit his eldest daughter, Goneril. And as he discovers later, the name alone the title of king without the authority is just a word. It's weak and ineffectual, and if the name is empty, then so too perhaps are all the forms and canons and customs of sovereign power. They are not natural. They do not inhere in the man or the state. Even more devastating, they are not evidence of divine sanction or favor. Perhaps the gods don't even exist then. There's a very minor exchange, but I think a really significant one between Lear and Kent. Kent has tried to calm Lear down. He's angry at Cordelia, and Kent tries to stop him. Lear gets very angry at Kent and says, "Now by Apollo," he sort of swears to the gods, but then nothing happens. He says, "Now by Apollo and Kent." And I think this is maybe his most impertinent line in the whole play. He says, "Now by Apollo, king, thou swearest thy gods in vain." Kent's pointing out the gods aren't listening to you. So maybe they don't exist, or if there are gods, maybe they don't really pay any attention to the affairs of men. As Gloucester later remarks so powerfully in that line, his famous line, "As flies to wanton boys are we to the gods, they kill us for their sport." So this problem that I'm describing here comes to a head with the love test. This is the singular event that sets disaster in motion. A seemingly sort of outlandish and unwarranted competition between the daughters. And it may seem bizarre to us as readers or to the audience, but to Lear's mind, it is a necessary demonstration of the sovereign and patriarchal power that he yet holds on to as essential to his identity. And Cordelia rejects it. She refuses to participate. Lear's other daughters, they falsify their love by flattery. They say what they think their father wants them to say, what he wants to hear. Goneril herself says that her love is inexpressible, a love that makes breath poor and speech unable, and yet she expresses it. Cordelia testifies to her love by choosing silence. She says, "Love and be silent. My love's more ponderous than my tongue." And later she points out the hypocrisy of her sisters' professions of love. "Why have my sisters husbands if they say they love you all?" she asks. "Happily, when I shall wed, that lord whose hand must take my plight shall carry half my love with him, half my care and duty. Sure, I shall never marry like my sisters, to love my father all," she says. So after such impudence from Cordelia, a direct assault on the core of Lear's identity, his being, he banishes her from his heart. He says, "I banish you from my heart," and compares her appalling disrespect to barbarians, to the barbarous Scythian and cannibals who devour their own children, which of course is ironic since he is himself trying to hurt his youngest daughter here. And this point is emphasized a few lines later when he informs Cornwall and Albany that Cordelia's territory will be, and I'm quoting him here, digested into their wives' dowries. After Cordelia is spurned, Lear is admonished by his senior advisor, by Kent, who calls the king's actions evil, that's his word, and quickly finds himself banished from court on penalty of death. And yet, for the rest of the play, Kent will remain loyal to Lear. He disguises himself as Caius and continues to risk his life ministering to the man who has given him his death sentence. So Cordelia and Kent then, and I think also in the play's secondary plot, Edgar too, the three of them represent a kind of plain-spoken love and duty, what Cordelia calls love according to my bond, no more nor less. It's a love that is deeper and truer than the flattery, the ceremony, and pageantry of the court, all the unnatural artifice of royal power to which Lear clings with increasing desperation. until it is shattered and literally just blown away at the end of Act 2. This selfless love that's embodied in Cordelia, I would call it humane love. It's perhaps humanity's best answer to the cold indifference of the natural world, and the only hope we have of reforming, rectifying, ameliorating the institutions that we raise up against the natural world. It's a lesson that Lear learns too late to save his daughter, and that Edgar cannot act in time to save his. So Act 1, Scene 1, a little later, lines 221 to 232 and 266 to 279. This is Cordelia defending her decision and admonishing her sisters Goneril and Regan. Cordelia's love, as we discussed, in the previous scene, her love does not acquiesce to the language of or comply with the language of custom and courtesy. Rather, her love expresses itself through action, through deeds. She says, "I want that glib and oily art to speak and purpose not," she tells Lear. "Since what I will intend, I'll do it before I speak." The King of France, interestingly, is so impressed by her forthrightness that he offers to marry her without any transfer of wealth or territory. She is herself a dowry, he says. It's also obvious that Cordelia sees through her sister's rhetoric and senses trouble. "I know what you are," she tells them, "and like a sister am most loath to call your faults as they are named." So I want to talk next about Edmund, Act 1, Scene 2, the first 120 lines of that scene, where he talks about primogeniture, how it's unfair, and begins plotting against his elder brother Edgar. Edmund this is going to sound strange to say, but Edmund is like Cordelia in one sense. He recognizes the arbitrariness and artificiality of social codes and customs. He tries to exploit those codes and customs, but he understands, I think, their artificiality. Like Orlando in As You Like It, he is on the wrong end of the laws of primogeniture that favor firstborn sons. And he suffers the double indignity of being illegitimate, of being a bastard. And that's how his father actually introduces him to Kent in the play's opening scene. I can't imagine he would like his father telling Kent this. "This knave came soothing saucily to the world before he was sent for." That is, before Gloucester was married to his mother. "Yet was his mother fair, there was good sport at his making, and the whoreson must be acknowledged." So whereas Cordelia was conceived in marriage, Edmund is the offspring of lust, libidinal energy, unmediated by the disciplinary language of church or state. Cordelia represents love, the redemptive power of love, but Edmund embodies self-serving ambition, natural drives, and carnal appetites. I like to think of Edmund as Richard III with sex appeal. He has this speech. He says, "Thou, nature, art my goddess. To thy law my services are bound. Wherefore should I stand in the plague of custom and permit the curiosity of nations to deprive me, for that I am some 12 or 14 moonshines lag of a brother? Why, bastard? Wherefore base?" After framing his older brother Edgar with a forged letter, he listens as his father, Gloucester, attributes Edgar's betrayal to the inauspicious alignment and transits of stars and planets. Gloucester says, "These late eclipses in the sun and moon portend no good to us." Edmund, he hears this and flatly rejects that human destiny is built into the architecture of the universe. He says, And I love this speech. He says, "This is the excellent foppery of the world, that when we are sick in fortune, often the surfeits of our own behavior, we make guilty of our disasters the sun, the moon, and stars, as if we were villains on necessity, fools by heavenly compulsion, knaves, thieves, and treacherers by spherical predominance, drunkards, liars, and adulterers by an enforced obedience of planetary influence, and all that we are evil in by a divine thrusting on. An admirable evasion of whoremaster man to lay his goatish disposition on the charge of a star. My father compounded with my mother under the dragon's tail, and my nativity was under Ursa Major, so that it follows I am rough and lecherous. I should have been that I am, had the maidleniest star in the firmament twinkled on my bastardizing. So Edmund then becomes the antithesis of Cordelia in another sense: selfish rather than selfless, vicious rather than virtuous. Cordelia marries, and through her influence, that partnership with the King of France becomes a means to attempt the restoration of her father to the throne. And the King of France later explains that much later in the play. Edmund does not marry, but he incites the competing lasciviousness of two women, Goneril and Regan, and uses the war with France as an opportunity to seize power and dispose of a marriage that is an obstacle to his gratification. Cordelia then becomes the corrective agent, corrective not only to fallible human institutions masquerading as natural order, but also to the grosser laws of nature that make those institutions susceptible to corruption. Those laws are embodied by Edmund, who later orders Cordelia's murder. So Act 1, Scene 4, lines 169 to 256. This scene, we're still in Act 1. Goneril orders her father to reduce the size of his retinue. She claims the knights are noisy and abusive to her servants, men so disordered, so debauched and bold, that this our court, infected with their manners, shows like a riotous inn. Epicurism and lust makes it more like a tavern or a brothel than a graced palace, she says. Her steward Oswald corroborates this, and I've got to say, when you read the play, when you read this speech, it's not like what she's saying is wrong. It sounds like Lear is being overbearing, and he begins now to realize his error in judgment. How ugly didst thou in Cordelia show, he says, which, like an engine, wrenched my frame of nature from the fixed place, drew from my heart all love, and added to the gall. Goneril's perceived intransigence and disrespect, like Cordelia's earlier, strikes at his sense of who he is. Does any here know me? This is not Lear. Who is it that can tell me who I am? And as he often does, the fool, Lear's companion in these scenes, gives a devastating answer. He says, "You are Lear's shadow." Act 2, Scene 4, the scene shifts from Goneril to Regan now, lines 126 to Act 2, Scene 4, lines 126 to 280. So having left Goneril, he turns to his daughter Regan and her husband, the Duke of Cornwall, but she too refuses him on grounds similar to Goneril's, saying that she is unprepared to host such a large group of knights. As the last vestige of his sovereign power, the loss of these knights exposes the arbitrariness of rank and privilege. It shows that kingship is not natural, but a fragile social construct. And without its signifying power, Lear finds himself reduced to a state closer to the wild beasts that he despises, and who moments later he will join when Cornwall and Regan order Gloucester to throw him out of the house, even as a violent storm erupts. Here's one of his important speeches from this scene. Our basest beggars are in their poorest things superfluous. Allow not nature more than nature needs. Man's life is cheap as a beast's. Thou art a lady, If only to go warm were gorgeous, why, nature needs not what thou gorgeous wearest, which scarcely keeps thee warm. But for true need, you heavens, give me that patience. Patience I need. You see me here, you gods, a poor old man, as full of grief as age, wretched in both. If it be you that stirs these daughters' hearts against their father, fool me not so much to bear it tamely. Touch me with noble anger, and let not women's weapons, water drops, stain my man's cheeks. No, you unnatural hags, I will have such revenges on you both that all the world shall. I will do such things, what they are, yet I know not, but they shall be the terrors of the earth. You think I'll weep? No, I'll not weep. I have full cause of weeping, but this heart shall break into 100,000 flaws, or ere I'll weep. O fool, I shall go mad. One of the striking things about this speech is Lear's inability to suppress raw emotion. He calls crying unmanly, as well as his sudden inability to articulate curses, something he's been very good at up to this point. He says, I will do such things, what they are, yet I know not. He wants to be touched by the wrath of the gods. He wants to be inspired with noble anger, but at this point he feels only sorrow. And this realization, he calls it madness. This realization inaugurates the painful course of abjection, purgation, and moral reform he will experience as he wanders the heath, buffeted by wind and rain. So Act 3, Scene 2, lines 1 through 60. These passages are just wonderful, I think wonderful poetry here, where Lear is out wandering the countryside in the middle of the storm. He acknowledges, on the one hand, the destructive energy of nature and its indifference to human concerns. And then on the other hand, he tries to understand it or contain it in a moral framework, either as the evil agent of his daughters, or as an instrument of divine justice. And so he positions himself either as a martyr or as a prophet. So let's look at a couple of these passages. The first one, rumble thy bellyful, he begins. Rumble thy bellyful, spit fire, spout rain, nor rain, wind, thunder, fire are my daughters. I tax not you, yon elements, with unkindness. I never gave you kingdom, called you children. You owe me no subscription. Then let fall your horrible pleasure. Here I stand your slave, a poor, infirm, weak, and despised old man. But yet I call you servile ministers, that will with two pernicious daughters join your high-engendered battles against a head so old and white as this. Oh, 'tis foul. And then at this point, he's discovered by Kent, who's been looking for him out in the heath. But then he continues, let the great gods that keep this dreadful putter o'er our heads find out their enemies now. Tremble, thou wretch, unwhipped of justice. Hide thee, thou bloody hand, thou perjured and thou similar virtue that art incestuous. Caitiff, to pieces shake, that under covert and convenient seeming has practiced on men's life. Close pin-up guilts, rive your concealing countenance, and cry these dreadful summoners' grace. I am a man more sinned against than sinning. So we'll move on to Act 3, Scene 5, lines 1 through 22, and Scene 7, lines 27 to 98. These are the scenes of Edmund's betrayal of his father to the Duke of Cornwall. He's disclosed that Gloucester has gone to lend his aid to Lear, despite the fact that Cornwall and Regan have forbidden it. and that he is working with Cordelia and the French to restore Lear to the throne. And Gloucester, he pays for this terribly in scene 7, where he is bound to a chair and manually enucleated by Cornwall. Maybe the most sadistic scene in all of Shakespeare's plays on stage. Though there are scenes in Henry VI, Part 3, and Richard III that come to mind that come very close in their sadism. What makes it even worse is while all this is happening to him, to Gloucester, he learns that the reason it's happening is that he's been betrayed by the son he trusted, by Edmund, and therefore he condemned the son that didn't do anything wrong. You know, the son, Edgar, the son who loves him. Perhaps a more interesting aspect of this scene is that Cornwall's cruelty in it is directly confronted by a servant who challenges him and says, "No, this is wrong." And he injures Cornwall, and that injury eventually kills him. This servant has the memorable lines, and it's interesting too that they're not spoken in the prose typically reserved for servant speech, but in iambic pentameter. He says, "Hold your hand, my lord. I have served you ever since I was a child, but better service have I never done you than now to bid you hold." This is an echo of Kent's correction of Lear in Act 1, which was also received with fiery indignation. So this fight between a nobleman and a servant must have been a particularly shocking moment for Shakespeare's audiences, an acknowledgement that gross abuses of power can and perhaps they should come to rebellion, to insurrection. The compassion the servants show for Gloucester afterward in the quarto, the 1608 quarto. Remember, those lines are cut from the folio, where they are talking about Regan and they're assisting Gloucester with his injuries. This is also significant because it's a display of capacity, of human capacity for empathy and for love, and it suggests, I think, that love, like the love of Cordelia for Lear or Edgar for Gloucester, that love transcends social class, and that it is what makes human beings different from the natural world, which often seems anyway indifferent to the suffering of others, and that this can redeem humanity from its baser instincts and perhaps purge corruption from institutions of social order. Although the bleak finale of the play, like the finale of Hamlet, leaves this ambiguous, raises doubts whether a world centered on principles of love can be attained. We don't see it demonstrated in the play. Act 3, Scene 6, and these include some lines from the quarto, which I've marked with Q here in the box. So lines 55, 1 through 13. So these are italicized lines in the conflated Norton text. And Act 4, Scene 1, lines 1 through 9, where Edgar is talking about the worst. I put that in quotation marks. So Gloucester has managed to bring Lear in out of the storm, but with Cornwall and Regan plotting to have him murdered, he sends Lear on to Dover on the south coast of Britain, where Cordelia and the French forces are encamped preparing for war. By this point, Lear is physically exhausted, mentally deranged, and as the fool Kent and Gloucester escort him away, Edgar delivers these lines in soliloquy, in heroic couplets. "When we our betters see bearing our woes, we scarcely think our miseries our foes. We who alone suffers most in the mind, leaving free things and happy shows behind. But then the mind such severance doth overskip, when grief hath mates and bearing fellowship. How light and portable my pain seems now, when that which makes me bend makes the king bow. Perhaps nowhere else in Shakespeare do we find a more concise and coherent theory of tragedy that aligns so closely with Aristotle's Poetics. The basic idea that the spectacle of suffering and tragedy, especially the suffering of individuals of elevated rank, has a purgative effect on the audience, lightening the ordinary load of human life, diminishing our individual pain by magnifying the pain of those greater than ourselves, reminding us of the universality of suffering and misery, and the relief that comes from witnessing that none of us suffers alone, no matter our social rank. So, related to Edgar's reflections on fellowship and suffering is the idea that the experience of abjection, and what I mean by that, abjection is the annihilation of the self and the systems of knowledge and institutions that sustain the self, which Edgar enacts himself, disguised as the possessed poor Tom, possessed by demons. So, related to his reflections on fellowship and suffering is the idea that the experience of abjection, the very worst that can be endured by a person this side of death, that this prostration of the self is the base from which hope might spring and love too. To be worst, he says, the lowest and most dejected thing of fortune stands still in esperance, lives not in fear. The lamentable change is from the best. The worst returns to laughter. Welcome then, thou unsubstantial air that I embrace. The wretch that thou hast blown into the worst owes nothing to thy blasts. So when we have nothing left to lose, we are in some ways stronger, freer. The moral courage is immediately challenged. This moral courage, I should say, is immediately challenged when Edgar learns that just when you think things can't get any worse, they sometimes do. And for him, it's the sight of his hideously disfigured and blinded father wandering over the heath. He has this great cry of despair, "World, world, O world, but that thy strange mutations make us hate thee, life would not yield to age." But he has nevertheless articulated one of the truths at the heart of the play, that when we are reduced to our most basic needs, we discover the fundamental value of love and fellowship. And even his father, Gloucester, glances upon this truth when he tells the man who's leading him across the barren landscape to let him be. You remember, Gloucester's blinded at this point. He says, "Away, get thee away. Good friend, be gone. Thy comforts can do me no good at all." And the old man says, "You cannot see your way." And Gloucester replies, "I have no way, and therefore want no eyes. I stumbled when I saw. Full oft 'tis seen our means secure us, and our mere defects prove our commodities." I say that Gloucester only glances upon this truth because at this point he's so overwhelmed with despair. He says, "I have no way," that he's hopeless, he's ready to embrace death, to yield his life, and is eager to dash himself upon the rocky shingle below the cliffs of Dover. Edgar's love will save him. We'll talk about that scene in just a moment. But first, we're going to talk about Act 4, Scene 2, lines 4 through quarto 39.6. So this includes some folio lines and quarto lines. It's a conflated speech. In this scene, or conflated scene, in this scene, Goneril takes Edmund as her lover, and Albany rebukes her. Like her sister Regan in the bloody Grand Guignol of Act 3, Scene 7, Goneril appears here as one of Shakespeare's most monstrous women. She's the prototype of Lady Macbeth in the tragedy Shakespeare probably wrote right after completing Lear. In her disgust with her husband Albany's reluctance to oppose the French, she becomes at once masculine. She says, "I must change names at home and give the distaff into my husband's hand." And in her exchange with her lover Edmund, blatantly, flagrantly sexual, transgressively sexual. Albany, who from the beginning has disapproved, Goneril and Regan's mistreatment of their father emerges in this scene as the play's voice of moral authority. His forceful reproach of Goneril is a sign of what is to come in Act 5. Although she may bear a woman's shape, he says, her repudiation of filial obligation and merciless cruelty to her father have transformed her into an unnatural fiend. He says, she that herself will sliver and disbranch from her material sap, perforce must wither and come to deadly use. Proper deformity seems not in the fiend so horrid as in woman. Perhaps Albany's most prescient remark is that if indeed there are no gods to intervene and punish men's abuses and restore virtue to its rightful place, in the course of time evil will turn on itself, as happens in the natural world. If that the heavens do not their visible spirits send quickly down to tame the vile offenses, it will come. Humanity must perforce prey on itself, like monsters of the deep. So Act 4, Scene 6, lines 1 through 81. If the circumstances of this scene weren't so awful, this would be an almost comical scene. Having been led to believe he's on the edge of the cliffs, Gloucester, remember he can't see, he makes the leap and he falls a few feet down to the ground and lies there as though he believed he'd actually plummeted, hundreds of feet from the cliff top. And for a moment, even Edgar believes that his father actually did die. He's like, wow, the illusion was so great, he actually died. I always enjoy reading Edgar's description of the cliffs of Dover. Really, really nice poetry here. How fearful and dizzy 'tis to cast one's eyes so low. The crows and choughs that wing the midway air show scarce so gross as beetles. Halfway down hangs one that gathers samphire, dreadful trade. Methinks he seems no bigger than his head. The fishermen that walked upon the beach appear like mice, and yond tall anchoring bark diminished to her cock a buoy almost too small for sight. The murmuring surge that on the unnumbered idle pebble chafes cannot be heard so high. I'll look no more, lest my brain turn and the deficient sight topple down headlong. It's a very clever piece of writing here, since Shakespeare paints in the mind of his audience the same false picture that he paints in the mind of his father. So Gloucester believes that he survived the fall, and Edgar, now pretending to be one of the peasant fishermen or beachcombers at the base of the cliffs, convinces him that it was a miracle, that it was an act of divine love that saved him from eternal damnation and given him a second chance at life. Edgar says, "This is above all strangeness. Upon the crown of the cliff, what thing was that which parted from you?" And Gloucester says, "A poor, unfortunate beggar." And Edgar says, "Well, as I stood here below, methought his eyes were 2 full moons. He had 1,000 noses, horns whelked and waved like the enraged sea. It was some fiend. Therefore, thou happy father, think that the clearest gods, who make them honors of men's impossibilities, have preserved thee." Gloucester says, "Well, henceforth I'll bear affliction till it do cry out itself, enough, enough, and die." So Gloucester is this idea that he's been saved by heaven has given him sort of renewed hope and courage to continue to bear his suffering. Edgar has to remind his father of this resolution to bear his afflictions later in Act 5. After Edmund repels the French and captures Lear and Cordelia, Gloucester is once more ready to yield up his life. He says, "A man may rot even here." And so in a passage that echoes Hamlet's words to Horatio before his fatal fight with Laertes, Edgar says, "Men must endure. They're going hence even as they're coming hither. Men must endure. Ripeness is all." And Gloucester said, "You're right. You're absolutely right. That's true." The conclusion of Gloucester's imaginary leap, by the way, is also a scene that puts an end to Edgar's poor Tom disguise. He doesn't reveal the truth of his identity to his father until the final scene of Act 5. But at this point, by saving his father, he is, in a sense, released from his demons as well. And I think that's worth pointing out. So I'll talk about just a few more scenes here. Got a few different speeches here, all of them from King Lear, to suffer immeasurably, to be the worst, as Edgar says, can bring despair and drive one towards death. O world, world, O world. Gloucester plainly demonstrates that this can make one just want to rot where one stands. But to be stripped of the trappings of privilege and prestige, to have nothing left of material value anyway, left to lose, this makes possible new insights into the limitations of rank, wealth, and even language. It also clears the way to give what may have been buried but was never completely lost. And I mean what I called earlier humane love. We see this in Lear's thoughts for the original inhabitants of the miserable, bug-infested hovel to which Kent takes him during the storm. In Act 3, Scene 4, he says, thinking about the people who live in these places, Lear says, "Poor naked wretches, wheresoe'er you are, that bide the pelting of this pitiless storm, how shall your houseless heads and unfed sides, your looped and windowed raggedness defend you from seasons such as these? Oh, I have ta'en too little care of this. Take physic, Pomp, expose thyself to feel what wretches feel, that thou mayst shake the superflux to them and show the heavens more just." So this, to feel what wretches feel, that's a really remarkable line to me, and gives us, I think, shows a shift in the way Lear is thinking about the world. He recognizes now as well the slipperiness and ineffectuality of language, particularly the language of law and power. Gloucester may have lost his eyes, but Lear encourages him to see corruption with his ears. He tells him, "A man may see how this world goes with no eyes. Look with thine ears. See how yond justice rails upon yond simple thief. How in thine ear change places, and handy-dandy, which is the justice, which is the thief. Thou hast seen a farmer's dog bark at a beggar, and the creature run from the cur. There thou mightst behold the great image of authority, a dog's obeyed in office." So switches back to the sense of sight, but painting an image for Gloucester. All of this culminates with his great speech consoling Cordelia as they're led away to prison in Act 5. It's a speech that totally repudiates everything that was once most important to Lear, and his readiness to embrace his daughter's simple, unconditional love. He no longer even has the desire to confront or curse his evil daughters, something he's been doing throughout the play. He even put them on trial at one point in the mock trial scene. Cordelia says, "Shall we not see these daughters and these sisters?" And Lear says, No, no, no. Come, let's away to prison. We two alone will sing like birds in the cage. When thou dost ask me blessing, I'll kneel down and ask of thee forgiveness. So we'll live and pray and sing and tell old tales and laugh at gilded butterflies and hear poor rogues talk of court news, and we'll talk with them too. Who loses and who wins, who's in, who's out, and take upon us the mystery of things, as if we were God's spies, and we'll wear out in a walled prison pacts and sects of great ones that ebb and flow by the moon. Great speech. Love it. Act 5, Scene 3, lines 39 to 83 and 111 to 50. I'm not going to say much about these. This is just the Edmund is accused of treason, and he fights with his brother Edgar, and Goneril. Her role in all this is discovered, and she stabs herself to death. I'm not going to read any speeches from the scene, but I do want you to look over, and there may be something in there for our class discussion later. For me, the most memorable aspect of these scenes is Edgar and his final metamorphosis. He started out, when he went into hiding as poor Tom, possessed by demons. So he goes from being this dispossessed, tormented man eating cow patties and pond scum into a heroic knight. It's impressive. It's impressive for audiences to see this evolution and to see it mature at this point. And it's not just a visual transformation, it's also linguistic. His voice and grammar modulate to his social rank. And to see all this play out on stage is pretty remarkable. I love the scene when he comes in full armor. And so finally, the last scene, Lear mourning the death of Cordelia. This is perhaps Shakespeare's most memorable and sustained scene of inconsolable anguish. Cordelia has been murdered on Edmund's order. It's made to look like a suicide, as Edmund himself confesses, and Lear carries her body on stage and grieves until he's ripe for death. What is really remarkable to me about Lear's death is how, even at the very end, he thinks that Cordelia lives. He's convinced that he can see her breathing, that her breast is rising and falling, her lips are moving. It's wonderfully ambiguous because for everyone else, to our eyes, she appears deceased. But as Lear prepares to join her, he imagines her miraculous revival, a kind of resurrection to which he alone is witness. He dies expressing a kind of hope, a flickering paternal joy, similar to Gloucester's death earlier in the scene when Edgar finally revealed his identity to his father, and his heart, we are told, burst smilingly. Kent advises those attending to Lear in his final moments to just leave him alone and let him die. He says he hates him that would upon the rack of this tough world stretch him out longer. Afterwards, after Lear's death, Albany appoints Kent and Edgar to rule over Britain in Lear's stead. But in a short speech, a speech that reverberates back to Cordelia's refusal to render her love and the courtly rhetoric of veneration at the beginning of the play, Edgar here declines to speak in the formalized voice of institutional authority tasked with ordering and regulating the human world, insisting instead on human sympathy. In the quarto, curiously, these lines are spoken by Albany, but it does seem more satisfying to give them to Edgar. He says, "The weight of this sad time we must obey. Speak what we feel, not what we ought to say." So the preference here is for earnest expression. The way of speaking that doomed Cordelia in the beginning. Edgar's last couplet, his last lines, are tantalizingly ambiguous. "The oldest hath borne most," he says. "We that are young shall never see so much, nor live so long." So how do we interpret this? As a deferential expression of respect for their forebears and their prolonged misery, or perhaps a hopeful declaration of youthful confidence that the next generation will avoid the errors and abuses of their elders, freeing themselves from the awful extremities that made life unbearable and death sometimes desirable. The idea that they will not have to witness the visceral horrors of their fathers, that relationships grounded in mutual feeling and hope and humane love will make life pleasurable and ripen us for an easeful death. So that brings to a close this lecture on King Lear. The photograph that you see here, those are the famous chalk cliffs of Dover on the south coast of England.